Welcome back, welcome back. Last Saturday, the Irish Prime Minister Brian Cowen resigned as leader of the Fianna Fáil party, but decided to try and stay on as Prime Minister until the next election. The next day, the Green Party of Ireland pulled out of the ruling coalition government, bringing forward the date of that next election, now due on February the 25th. But does the move really change anything for the former Celtic tiger? Ireland's economy is still in crisis, its housing bubble has burst, and few believe that a general election will do much to sort out the mess. So what next? I'm joined from Dublin by the man who pulled the plug on the coalition, Green Party leader John Gormley. John, welcome. Good to have you with us. Presumably you think that the government will last long enough for the election not to be until February the 25th.
Well, yes, David, the Dáil is due to meet again on Tuesday next. We're now in opposition, but in all likelihood it will dissolve on Tuesday, and therefore we will have an election probably on February the 25th. And it promises to be quite an eventful an election. There is a great sense of divisiveness in the country at the moment, and as you've rightly pointed out, the Celtic tiger is no more. We now have a very severe economic recession, probably the worst that we've ever experienced in our history. And you've also pointed out something which I think is very important, that is the room to manoeuvre is very limited, so that we could have an election where parties are offering probably a lot of false hope to people in many cases. And I think it's important that we have as honest an election as we can, looking at the public finances, what realistically can be done, and what can be done to create jobs, real jobs in the economy. But let's have none of the sort of false promises, the idea that we can somehow reverse the very severe cuts that we've just experienced in our budget. And as you may know, that budget had to make about 6 billion in adjustments, which is quite unprecedented in our economic history.
Right, and having reached this situation now, the government will obviously be protected in its life by the fact that the meeting in the Dáil next week. But as the man who pulled the plug, as they say, do you plan to make a coalition deal now, or are you going to run alone this time?
Well, we've always taken the view that as a Green Party, we should not exclude other parties, and that we would either enter coalition or perhaps seek to get some of our policies implemented from opposition. And that's by far and away the best and most constructive approach. It looks like at this stage, if you were to judge by the various opinion polls, that the Fine Gael party, that is the main opposition party, and the Labour Party will have a fairly sizable majority in the House, and therefore, in all likelihood, the Green Party would be in opposition. But having said that, there is 4 weeks of a campaign. There's a lot of opportunity for people to set out their stalls and to really examine in detail what the policies are of the various parties, because, as I said earlier, you will often see in election campaigns empty promises being made, promises that simply cannot be fulfilled, and the idea that incoming parties can reverse the severe cuts is really a fiction, and that has to be exposed in the course of a campaign.
And really, you're implying by all of this that whoever wins the next election is not going to be able to cure Ireland's endemic economic problems like that, or even twice. It's insoluble at the moment in the short term, isn't it?
Well, I wouldn't be as pessimistic as all that. We have two economies operating right now. We have our export economy, which is actually booming. Our domestic economy, because of lack of confidence, is doing a lot worse, and we have to engender that sense of confidence. But of course, in order to do that, we have to make adjustments. We've had a series of governments now in this country that really got it very wrong when it came to public expenditure and tax policy as well. We had a low tax regime and a high expenditure regime, and of course that is a recipe for economic disaster. This is why we've had to make these adjustments. Now, once these adjustments kick in, I think we will see a continuing perhaps deflationary cycle. But after that, I would be confident that the domestic economy will pick up, that confidence will pick up, and that we can again start to create jobs. So it isn't as pessimistic as you may think it is. Having said that, the only way that that can be achieved is by people making those hard economic decisions. And so far, it would appear that there are certain parties that want to shy away from that. There has been talk as well about renegotiating the deal that we got with the IMF. Again, that cannot be done unilaterally. We've got to actually do it in the context of the Eurozone countries. And that, again, is difficult because of the position of Germany, the domestic politics in Germany. All of that has to be discussed in detail in the course of this campaign.
So how long before you'll be a Celtic tiger again?
Well, I don't really think we should aspire to that, because the Celtic tiger was exactly what gave rise to our economic difficulties. We've had this housing bubble, we've had severe overzoning of land in this country, and as a result we've had very bad planning as well, and this is something that the Green Party tried to remedy in government by introducing rigorous planning legislation. We've also put in place now a new regulator for the first time. Someone from outside has been given that position, and it's better resourced, because a lack of financial regulation was at the heart of our problem as well. And similarly, we've now put in place a new governor of the central bank, so that we can't have the sort of laissez-faire capitalism that we saw during the Celtic Tiger era, and we have to ensure that we don't go through any more booms and busts. So I wouldn't aspire to going back to this Celtic Tiger, which was really built on sand, and we have to have a much more robust economy, which is actually based on sound economic principles and based on sustainability as well. And this is why the Green Party went into government, to ensure that we can have an ecologically sustainable society as well.
One last thing, was joining the euro a mistake in retrospect, do you think?
Well, you know, it's one of those issues that we will debate at length in this country, but certainly it seems to me anyway that if you were to look at the euro, we in this country, and indeed some of the peripheral countries, we enjoyed those low interest rates, and as a result our economies grew and grew. Now, it seems to me that those interest rates were best suited to some of the core countries, and we were not in a position, therefore, to either devalue, or we were not in a position to actually increase interest rates. So we had lost the tools of our, to actually look after our own economic fate, so to speak. So in that sense, the euro was probably premature. Having said that, we're now very much reliant on help from the European Union, from the Commission and others, and we find ourselves in a very difficult situation. So I think, we have to re-examine the euro. That is being done at present, but as I referred to earlier, we have difficulties with the German Chancellor, who has, for her own political reasons, got to look at what is happening in our own country, the unpopularity of, for example, increasing the bailout fund, the unpopularity of perhaps decreasing the interest rate for this country, the rate at which we have to pay it back. All of these things have to be looked at in detail, and it will be an interesting number of months after the next government is formed, because Ireland and Greece and other countries are going to have to go in there and seek at some stage to look again at the agreements that were made.
We'll be watching the events of the next, well, first of all, the next week or two with great interest. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, John. We appreciate it.
Thank you, David. Thank you very much.
The week's big story, of course, has been the release by Al Jazeera, as it happens, of leaked documents showing the inside story of the Middle East negotiations, the so-called Palestine Papers. Now, 1 month ago, in this area of leaks and so on, I spoke to the WikiLeaks founder, Julian Assange, and I asked him what at the time seemed a really hypothetical question. And here it is. If you were given a secret document betraying the Palestinian negotiating position in the Middle Eastern talks, and if you revealed that, the talks would end, whereas otherwise the Palestinians might get a point, win the debate. If you publishing something like that would destroy the Palestinian position, what would your decision be about publishing?
We have an analogy to the situation you were talking about, which was the negotiations between Iceland and the UK for a huge debt. Very, very sensitive negotiations that would put each family, make liable each family in Iceland for 60,000 euros over a 20 or 30-year period. Really quite crippling to Iceland. And into that sway, there was the IMF, the United States, Britain pulling in the Paris Club in favours. And we released some key diplomatic cables and the negotiation documents themselves, the respective positions of the different parties, to the public. And did that cripple and rip asunder that negotiation in a way that was bad for the people? No, it drove Iceland's first referendum, where the people overturned a position made under pressure by the Icelandic parliament, something that Icelanders are very proud of, a referendum that was passed with over 96% in favour. So getting out the position documents to the people who are going to have to carry them out is actually very important. Otherwise you have a situation where there can be a stitch-up between the negotiators. Remember, these negotiators like to go to each other. There's cocktail parties, they can be employed later on in different organisations, they have the ability to go overseas because they're operating at a high level and have many contacts. But the people on the ground who are employing the negotiators, they don't do that. And that's a long-term, we've seen that happen over years and years, that there's a stitch-up in negotiations that the people do not like and are very unhappy with. So maybe sometimes it would be harmful, but as far as our experience has been, it's been helpful.
Julian Assange speaking there. Right now we welcome two very important figures in this story. First, I'm joined from Ramallah on the West Bank by Hanan Ashrawi, who is a former minister, of course, in the Palestinian Authority, and from Washington by Aaron David Miller, who has advised 6 US Secretaries of State on the Middle East. Hanan, let me come to you first of all. There was originally the Palestinian Authority dismissed all these leaks as a pack of lies, but now they do admit that there parts of the material is true. What are your feelings about it, and about the feelings that was raised there by Julian Assange, that sometimes leaks can be constructive, and were these constructive?
Well, yes, in the larger scheme of things, leaks are important if they fall into the people's right to know, and if they expose what is essentially in a neutral way, what is essentially in the people's interest. What is happening is when leaks become a political weapon, with ill will, and with an attempt to steer them in a certain direction, they form a certain type of incitement or provocation, particularly if you focus on the wrong things, if you take things out of context, if you doctor a few words here and there. So in a sense, there's a difference between neutral leaks, where the documents are presented as they are, or when you have them as part of a PR campaign with very serious political objectives and implications, seeking to destabilize a system or seeking actually to put a certain spin on those leaks. And that's the difference between WikiLeaks and the so-called Palestine documents. I think the motivations are different. And of course, I think Al Jazeera Arabic, has done something which is quite suspect. But at the same time, I believe that some of the documents, yes, are true. Some of them are doctored. Some have been selected. Some are out of context. There was a deliberate attempt to show everything that is negative, in a way, everything that will resonate negatively among the Palestinian public, and to undermine the negotiators and the leadership. But sometimes they serve to break certain taboos. They serve to expose attitudes that have been hidden. And in this case, it's not just the Palestinians, but the Israelis and the Americans as well.
In your case, Aaron, looking at this situation, were you surprised by what you read and what you heard, or was this what you expected? And do you find it constructive or destructive?
I mean, I think I'd make 3 points, David. Number one, this was clearly a willful, malicious effort by someone or somebodies to undermine the authority, credibility, and integrity of the Palestinian Authority and its negotiators. Second, there's no question, though, that many of the positions ascribed to Palestinian negotiators in these documents were, in fact, positions that Palestinians have taken over the course of the last decade, beginning with the failed July 2000 Camp David summit. But I have to say that in a negotiation, and this is, I think, critically important to understand, Palestinians and Israelis functioned according to the live and die principle that nothing is agreed until everything is agreed, which enables a negotiator to float all kinds of creative ideas without having them locked into concrete. Now, it requires a certain amount of discretion, but since there has been no agreement reached between Israelis and Palestinians in the last 10 years, anything that is put into the mouth of a Palestinian negotiator is merely a device. It's an instrument. And I think the Palestinian media and the publics don't appreciate that fact, but it's a very, very important point. Finally, one additional point is worth making. There's no question, and I don't want to overdo this because the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is not a morality play which pits the forces of goodness on one hand against the forces of darkness on the other. But there's no question, if you invited a man or a woman from Mars down to take a look at these documents, that alien being would reach three conclusions, looking at the period 2008 to 2009. Number one, the Palestinians were prepared to be quite flexible and come up with very creative and pragmatic fixes to some of these problems, like Jerusalem. The Israelis were largely silent, more questions than answers, and seemed reluctant to express their positions. And the Americans, in this case the Bush administration, Bush 43, really didn't know how to deal with the realities of the moment. So I think they're instructive as a window, but the reality is, David, that window has now changed. The Prime Minister of Israel is not Ehud Olmert, who was indicted. The lead Israeli negotiator is not Tzipi Livni, who is now in the opposition. And you have the Obama administration. And you have a peace process. Hanan may not agree, although I think she'll agree with the analysis. The prescription is another matter. You have a peace process that is in deep trouble. Weak leaders on each side, huge gaps between the parties, an administration that has stumbled over the course of the last 20 months, and a regional environment now with Egypt, which really is going to make progress on the Israeli-Palestinian issue if it needed any more difficulties, and it doesn't. Much harder.
Thank you very much. Coming back to you, Hanan, do you feel that the impact of these revelations and the impact of what's been said in them and so on has made a deal more difficult, more endangered, more damaged, or could things not have been any worse than they were a week ago anyway in terms of making peace?
Well, the irony is that right now everybody's talking about talks which are non-existent. The negotiations have stopped for a long time for a variety of reasons, many of which you can see in the documents. American lack of political will, American absolute bias to Israel, American lack of ability and utter helplessness when it comes to Israeli violations and Israeli policies, and of course putting pressure on the Palestinians rather than on the Israelis at all times, and demanding impossible concessions, and trying to manage a conflict rather than to solve it, and not presenting any position beyond a cover, legal, political, even in terms of public discourse for Israel. All these things have plagued the so-called peace process for a long time. And it's true, what Aaron said, America has been muddling through, but I don't think that's a prescription. I think that's a result of a seriously misguided foreign policy. As far as the Palestinians are concerned, this is going really to enhance and deepen the rift and increase the polarization on the ground between Hamas and Fatah and the nationalists, and therefore make it much more difficult to effect any kind of reconciliation that would empower Palestinian political discourse and any kind of reconciliation or peacemaking. And of course, it exposes that Israel, no matter what concessions it demands, is going to ask for more and is not going to reciprocate in any way. And given the nature of this government, we certainly do not expect any progress whatsoever, because this is a government that's not committed to peace. So in many ways you might say, as I said earlier, that there's an exposure of many taboos, there is a sort of, however ill-intended, but there is an exposure of Palestinian flexibility. And I agree that nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. I'm surprised at the nature of these documents, because many of them are in the form of chats. You know, nothing conclusive, nothing agreed to, nothing signed. And all the official documents that were presented do not reflect this type of chit-chat or discussions that took place in closed rooms and behind closed doors. So in a sense, the official positions are those that were presented in writing, officially, signed, and so on, but not the exploratory talks that were taken out of context and were used to make the talks all that more difficult in the future.
Thank you very much indeed. And Aaron, what about the picture of Israel that emerges from these documents? As Hanan was saying there, many people have taken the view that Israel comes out as a rather uncooperative non-negotiator in this rather obdurate situation they seem to adopt. Is that your view of your snapshot of Israel as it emerges this week?
When Israelis make peace, because of the unique nature of their circumstances, they're a very great power, but in some respects they're a tiny power living on the knife's edge. They do so with extreme caution and in a very incremental way. Now, Yitzhak Rabin was prepared to negotiate on Oslo. Ehud Barak was prepared to negotiate at Camp David and with the Syrians. But the reality is the Israelis have always been extremely careful and deliberate with respect to the way they conduct themselves in a negotiation. And if you look at these documents, that's precisely what you see. And in a way, even though the Palestinians have been extremely creative in some of their positions, their own views don't differentiate and depart. And this is the reality on the ground. Don't depart much from the conventional, traditional Palestinian narrative. And frankly, either does the Israeli. So in the end, David, I think the problem, frankly, in my judgment, on both sides, is really the lack of ownership. No one is prepared. And this is why we don't have a serious process. The Americans are a separate problem for sure. No one is prepared to consider making the kinds of decisions, that excruciatingly painful decisions, and sell them to their respective publics that will be required to reach a conflict-ending agreement on the four core issues: Jerusalem, borders, security, and refugees.
Right.
And the United States is put in a very difficult position, because if the gaps aren't bridgeable, then you have a difficult proposition with respect to any administration. Frankly, doesn't want to fail.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you both very much indeed. We're unfortunately at the end of our time, but Hanan, we thank you very much indeed. Aaron, we thank you, both of you. And that, in fact, is all for this week. My thanks to all of my guests. Do join us here again in 7 days' time for another Frost Over the World.